Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Today, we're diving into nonviolent communication, NVC for short. Our listener wants to learn this communication style, and we're using as our guide, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life by Marshall Rosenberg. And this book is a favorite of some pretty big names, Deepak Chopra, Jack Canfield. So I knew we were in for something pretty interesting, but I have to admit, when I first skimmed through the chapter titles, empathy, protective use of force, even liberating ourselves from old programming, I thought, this is a lot more than just learning how to say please nicely.
It really is. It's a whole different mindset. You know, Rosenberg goes beyond just like giving you some new words. It's about transforming how you approach conflict and connection in general.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. What is nonviolent communication? I mean, I'm kind of picturing a peaceful protest, everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya.
Well, you can put the guitar down for a second. NVC is about communicating with compassion. At its core, it's about focusing on feelings and needs. It's not about being passive or a pushover. In fact, you can learn to set boundaries while being compassionate, so you don't have to choose between your needs and others.
So is it like compassionate assertiveness? Is that a thing?
Exactly. You know, it's about understanding the root causes of conflict and then addressing them in a way that respects everyone. Rosenberg lays out this four-part process in the book: observation, feeling, needs, request. And it's a framework for expressing yourself clearly, but also for understanding others more deeply.
That makes sense. But how is that different from how most of us already communicate? I mean, we talk about our feelings and what we want, right?
You'd think so, but Rosenberg argues that many of us actually grow up with what he calls life-alienating communication. It's this language of blame, judgment, and demands. And it's the type of talk that leaves you feeling disconnected, even when you're having a conversation.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced this. It's that language that makes you feel judged or misunderstood, small even. The book dives deep into this, and I have to say, it was a bit of a wake-up call for me.
Yeah, me too. Rosenberg gives some pretty stark examples, judging people as lazy or stupid, making comparisons that make others feel inadequate, or using language that denies choice, like should or have to. There's even this study he mentions that correlates judgmental language with violence across different cultures. It's like the way we talk can impact our actions.
Wow, yeah. That's a pretty heavy thought. So if life-alienating communication is the problem, is NVC the solution?
I'd say it's definitely a powerful tool. And a key part of that is empathy. That's really at the heart of NVC, according to Rosenberg.
You know, this reminds me of a story from the book. I think it really illustrates how, even in really intense situations, people crave just being truly understood. There's this story about this elderly woman. She basically tells a volunteer that she wants to die. And instead of arguing with her or, offering some kind of platitude, the volunteer just listens and reflects the woman's feelings back to her.
That's a really beautiful example of empathy in action. You know, it's not about agreeing with the other person or condoning their actions. It's about getting what they're going through on an emotional level.
And in the story, that simple act of being heard made her feel seen and valued. And she ended up not going through with it. I mean, how powerful is that? But let's face it, a lot of times we're dealing with some pretty strong emotions, like anger, not just sadness. So how does NVC deal with that?
Well, NVC doesn't shy away from anger. In fact, it sees anger as a valuable piece of information.
Oh, okay. So instead of telling someone, calm down, we should be listening to their anger. But how does that actually work?
Okay, so instead of suppressing the anger or lashing out, NVC encourages us to pause and ask ourselves, what need of mine is not being met in this situation? What am I feeling hurt about? What am I longing for? And there's this great story in the book. Rosenberg talks about getting hit in the nose. Twice, but he only felt anger once.
Wait, what? Hit in the nose? Okay, I need to hear more about this story.
Okay, so in one instance, he judged the person who hit him, and that triggered, like, intense anger. But the other time, he actually understood the situation and felt compassion for the person. And so, even though there was pain, he didn't experience anger.
Wow. So it's like our interpretation of what's happening fuels the anger more than the actual event itself.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that anger often masks deeper feelings and unmet needs.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together. But I still have some questions. We've talked about observation, feelings, needs, even anger. But how do we express those needs in a way that, actually gets them met? Is that where the request part of the NVC process comes in?
Yeah, you got it. So in NVC, requests are about clearly and specifically stating what we need. Without demands or coercion, it's about inviting the other person to cooperate, not forcing them.
Okay, so this sounds great in theory, but I can see how that could be challenging in practice. What happens when the other person just isn't receptive to NVC?
That's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll dive into next.
So we've laid some groundwork here for nonviolent communication, observing without judging, connecting with feelings and needs, and then making clear requests. But I gotta say, I'm kind of stuck on that last one. What happens if the other person just isn't buying it? Do we just repress our needs just to avoid conflict?
Yeah, it's a really common concern, and honestly, NVC isn't some magic formula. It doesn't guarantee that suddenly everyone's going to agree with you and, happily meet your needs. But it does give you a framework to navigate these tough conversations with more awareness and compassion for yourself and the other person.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Say I'm trying to have a difficult conversation with my partner and they're just not getting it. Am I supposed to just keep repeating, I feel hurt, I need more quality time, until they cave?
Oh, well, not exactly. Remember, NVC is all about connection, not manipulation. And sometimes that means taking a step back and recognizing that the other person might not be in a place to really hear you at that moment. Maybe they're stressed, distracted, or even triggered by something you're saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know I definitely shut down when I feel attacked or criticized, even if the other person says it's coming from a place of love.
Exactly. And that's why NVC really emphasizes self-empathy. Before we can truly connect with others, we need to be in touch with our own feelings and needs. So in that situation with your partner, instead of getting frustrated that they're not responding the way you hoped, maybe you pause and ask yourself, what's going on for me right now? Am I feeling hurt, rejected, or maybe even scared?
So it's like taking a time out to sort of check in with yourself before trying to fix the other person.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that both people in a conflict are experiencing their own emotions and unmet needs. And by acknowledging those needs on both sides, you create space for understanding and compromise.
Okay, I'm getting that. But what about those times when it feels like people's needs just clash fundamentally? What if my need for quiet time conflicts with my partner's need for social connection? How do we find a solution that works for both of us?
That's where the real creativity of NVC comes in. It's not about finding this perfect solution where everyone gets everything they want. It's more about exploring possibilities and being willing to compromise. So maybe you and your partner agree on designated quiet time in the evenings, but you also schedule a regular date night to satisfy that need for connection.
Yeah, I like that. It's about finding that balance, not just sacrificing one person's needs for the others.
Exactly. And that can be tough, especially when we're used to communicating in ways that are more about, winning or losing.
Speaking of winning and losing, I want to go back to something you said earlier about NVC not being a guarantee. What happens when you do everything right? You express your feelings and needs clearly, you make a respectful request, and the other person still says no.
Yeah, that's when it gets really challenging. And honestly, there's no easy answer there. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, the other person just isn't willing or able to meet our needs. And that's okay. It doesn't mean we've failed at NVC. It just means we need to accept that reality and figure out how to move forward.
So it's not about forcing people to change or manipulating them to give us what we want.
Definitely not. In fact, Rosenberg talks about how forcing someone to do something often backfires. It might get us what we want in the short term, but it damages the relationship and can lead to resentment in the long run.
This reminds me of the Bleck's discussion on the protective use of force. And I have to admit, when I saw that chapter title, I was a little confused. Doesn't nonviolent communication mean NO violence?
Right. It's a common misconception. Rosenberg dedicates a whole chapter to explaining that NVC recognizes that there are times when using force is necessary, to protect ourselves or others from harm. But he's very clear that this should always be a last resort, and it should be done with, as much compassion and awareness as possible.
So it's not about punishing someone or getting revenge.
No, absolutely not. It's about preventing harm, while still recognizing the humanity of the person we're using force against. Rosenberg actually makes a distinction between what he calls punitive force and protective force. Punitive force is about inflicting pain or punishment, while protective force is about preventing harm.
Oh, okay. Could you give an example of that? I think it would help our listener understand the difference.
Sure. Imagine a child is running into the street. A parent might grab the child, maybe even roughly, to pull them back from danger. That would be protective force. It's not about punishing the child. It's about keeping them safe.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. But what about situations where there's no, immediate physical danger, but someone's consistently violating our boundaries or treating us poorly? How does NVC handle that?
That's where setting clear boundaries and consequences comes in. NVC isn't about being a doormat or letting people walk all over you. It's about learning to advocate for your needs while still being respectful of others.
So how do we do that? I mean, how do we set boundaries without, resorting to blame or ultimatums?
It starts with being clear on what your needs are and what behaviors are just unacceptable to you. Then you can communicate those boundaries clearly and calmly to the other person.
So, for example, I might say to someone, I need to feel respected in our conversations. When you interrupt me or talk over me, it makes me feel unheard. So I'm asking you to please wait until I'm finished speaking before you share your thoughts.
Exactly. You're stating your need, describing the behavior that's not okay, and making a clear request for change.
But what if they just keep interrupting? Do you just keep repeating yourself like a broken record?
Yeah. Well, that's where consequences come in. And these don't have to be punishments. They can be natural outcomes of the situation.
Okay, so if someone kept interrupting me, I might say, I see you're not able to respect my request right now, so I'm going to end this conversation, and we can try again later when you're ready to listen.
Exactly. You're setting a consequence that protects your need for respect without resorting to, blame or aggression.
This is really helpful. I feel like NVC gives us a roadmap for navigating those tricky situations that used to just leave me feeling, powerless.
Or resentful. It definitely offers a new way of approaching conflict. And remember, it's a practice, not a perfection. It takes time and patience to unlearn old patterns of communicating and replace them with more compassionate and effective ones.
And speaking of unlearning old patterns, I want to talk about a concept from the book that really intrigued me. Emotional liberation. Rosenberg describes it as like a process of moving from emotional slavery to emotional liberation. What does he mean by that?
It's fascinating, isn't it? He's really talking about this journey. Moving from feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions to recognizing that we're only responsible for our own. And he breaks it down into 3 stages. The first stage is what he calls emotional slavery, which is kind of where a lot of us start.
Emotional slavery. That sounds pretty intense.
It can be.
Yeah.
It's where we believe we're responsible for how other people are feeling, We're constantly striving to keep everyone around us happy, and if they're not, we feel guilty or responsible.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
Always trying to please everyone.
It really is. And then Rosenberg says, we often swing to the other extreme, what he calls the obnoxious stage. This is where we kind of rebel against that emotional slavery and assert our own needs, but often in ways that are demanding or insensitive to others.
So it's like going from one extreme to the other without finding that middle ground.
Exactly. And then finally, there's emotional liberation. This is where we learn to respond to the needs of others out of compassion, not fear, guilt, or shame. We can honor both our own needs and the needs of others without having to sacrifice either.
It sounds like that's the ultimate goal of NVC, reaching this level of emotional liberation, where we can communicate authentically and compassionately, even in challenging situations.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that our needs are interconnected. We can meet our own needs while also contributing to the well-being of others. It's like this win-win approach to relationships.
This deep dive into NVC has been so eye-opening. It's more than just a communication technique. It's like a whole philosophy of life.
Absolutely. And it's a philosophy that can really transform our relationships with ourselves and others.
There's still so much to unpack. We'll be right back to continue exploring NVC and delve into some even deeper concepts.
We're back, and this deep dive into nonviolent communication has really gotten me thinking about how I communicate, not just with others, but like with myself. We were just talking about emotional liberation, and I'm realizing how often I get stuck in that emotional slavery mindset, always feeling responsible for everyone else's happiness.
It's definitely a common trap, especially for people who are, naturally empathetic. But Rosenberg argues that true compassion actually comes from a place of freedom, not obligation.
Yeah. That makes sense. But how do we shift out of that mindset? I mean, it feels so ingrained, like it's part of my DNA or something.
It's definitely a process, and it starts with awareness. Recognizing when you're falling into that trap of taking on other people's emotions as your own,
So, for example, if my friend's going through like a tough breakup and I start feeling all anxious and depressed myself, that's a sign I might be slipping into emotional slavery. It could be, yeah. It's natural to empathize with our friends' struggles, but there's a difference between empathizing and internalizing their emotions.
So how do we find that balance? How do we offer support to our friends without getting, swallowed up by their emotional turmoil?
Well, Rosenberg suggests that when we find ourselves, really overwhelmed by someone else's emotions, we need to kind of step back.
Yeah.
And focus on our own needs.
Oh, okay. So it's like that whole oxygen mask analogy they give you on airplanes. You have to put on your own mask before you can help others.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we can't pour from an empty cup. If we're not taking care of our own emotional well-being, we're not going to be much help to anyone else.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But what about those times when it's not our friends' emotions that we're struggling with, but our own? I mean, we talked a lot about, dealing with anger constructively, but what about other difficult emotions? Sadness, fear, even shame.
That's where that practice of self-empathy comes in. It's the same four-step process we use for connecting with others. Observation, feeling, needs, request, but we turn it inwards.
Oh, okay. So, if I'm feeling anxious about giving a presentation, instead of just ignoring it or trying to push it down, I would first acknowledge, the physical sensations of the anxiety, the tightness in my chest, my racing heart.
Exactly. Just noticing those sensations without judgment. That's the first step. And then you can name the feeling, okay, I'm feeling anxious, and then explore what need might be underlying that anxiety.
So maybe I'm feeling anxious because I need reassurance that I'm going to do well, or I need to feel more prepared and confident.
Exactly. And once you've identified that need, you can start brainstorming ways to meet it.
So maybe I could practice the presentation with a friend, or, try visualizing myself doing well.
Yeah, those are great ideas. And sometimes the request might just be as simple as acknowledging the feeling and giving yourself permission to feel it.
So I might just say to myself, it's okay to feel anxious. This is a big deal, and it's natural to have some nerves. I'm going to just breathe deeply and allow myself to feel this, and then I'm going to focus on what I can do to prepare.
Yeah, that's a great example of self-empathy in action. It's about offering ourselves that same kindness and understanding that we would offer a dear friend.
I'm realizing how important this self-empathy thing is. It's like the foundation for everything else we've been talking about.
I totally agree. It's really the key to emotional liberation and to building healthier relationships with ourselves and others.
Okay, I know we're almost out of time for this deep dive, but there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Rosenberg talks about replacing diagnoses with NVC. What does he mean by that?
It's a really provocative idea, isn't it? He's challenging the way we often label people with diagnoses, like depressed or anxious, without truly understanding the needs that might be driving those behaviors.
So instead of saying my partner's being selfish, I might try to understand what need they're trying to meet with their behavior. Like maybe they're feeling lonely and they're seeking attention, or maybe they're feeling overwhelmed and need some space.
Exactly. And by focusing on the needs, we shift from judging and labeling to understanding and connecting. It's a much more compassionate way to approach challenges in our relationships.
This has been incredible. It feels like NVC offers us a whole new language for understanding ourselves and others, and a really powerful set of tools for creating more compassionate and fulfilling relationships.
No, it's definitely a practice, not a perfection, but I think it's a path worth exploring. And even if you don't master every aspect of NVC, incorporating even a few of these principles into your life can have a huge impact.
Well, I am so glad we took this deep dive together. It's given me so much to think about and apply to my own life.
Me too. It's always inspiring to revisit these principles and remember their power.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive sparked your curiosity and gave you some valuable insights into the world of nonviolent communication. Remember, this is just the beginning. There's so many resources out there, books, workshops, even online communities for those who want to explore further. So keep learning, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep connecting. See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.